The mahogany table stretched between them like a polished runway of unearned privilege. For 23 years, Julian had watched the corporate elite look right through him. But today, a single manila folder was about to trigger an absolute devastating boardroom silence. The air in the executive boardroom smelled of expensive Arabica coffee, Italian leather, and the distinct suffocating aroma of unearned confidence. Julian sat perfectly still, his hands resting lightly on the cool surface of the mahogany table. To anyone else, he looked exactly like what his badge claimed: a mid-level manager, part of the office scenery, as dependable and overlooked as the ficus tree in the corner. For 23 years, Julian had arrived at 7:45 a.m., meticulously logged his data, and left at precisely 5 p.m. He didn't mingle at happy hours. He didn't play corporate politics, and he never asked for a corner office. What he did do, however, was redirect a strict 40% of his modest paycheck into a dedicated brokerage account every single month, quietly absorbing fractional shares, dividend reinvestments, and block orders of the company's stock like a sponge in a slow leak. Across from him sat Julian's polar opposite, Brandon Vance, the newly appointed Senior Vice President of Operations, and, more importantly, the son of the chairman of the board, swiveled in his ergonomic chair. Brandon wore a tailored suit that cost more than Julian's first 3 cars combined. He was 29, radiated the aggressive energy of a man who believed the world owed him an apology for existing, and was currently looking at Julian as if he were a smudge on a pristine window. "Let's be real here, Julian," Brandon said, tossing a glossy, multi-million-dollar restructuring proposal onto the table with a theatrical sigh. "The company is evolving. We need synergy, we need disruption, and frankly, we need people who move at the speed of capital, not people who are just waiting out their pensions." Julian didn't blink. He simply adjusted his glasses, watching the young man run his fingers through his perfectly styled hair. The boardroom was filled with senior VPs and directors, all of them suddenly finding their legal pads incredibly fascinating. Nobody wanted to cross the chairman's son, even if Brandon's new streamlining plan involved cutting the department Julian had spent 2 decades building from scratch. Brandon leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood, deliberately invading Julian's space. A smug, patronizing smile touched his lips, the look of a predator who thought he was dealing with a vegetarian. He wanted a reaction. He wanted Julian to sweat, to beg, or to storm out in a fit of pride so they could fire him for cause. What Brandon didn't realize was that the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous, and Julian had been waiting for this exact meeting longer than Brandon had been alive. The silence in the room solidified, growing so dense you could hear the faint hum of the climate control system buried deep within the walls. Brandon leaned back, crossing his legs with a casual, almost athletic grace, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of his own absolute authority. He tapped a heavy gold pen against his knee, a rhythmic, irritating ticking sound that felt like a countdown. "We appreciate your decades of service, Julian, truly," Brandon continued, his voice dripping with a superficial corporate warmth that fooled absolutely no one. "But the market doesn't care about nostalgia. My father didn't build this empire by keeping people around out of sentimentality. You're just a junior manager now, and your department is a legacy bottleneck. It's time to pass the torch." Julian let the words hang in the air, allowing Brandon's arrogance to echo off the soundproof glass panels. He didn't flinch. He didn't look down at his hands. Instead, a very faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth. The kind of smile a grandmaster gives a novice who thinks a random check is a checkmate. With agonizing, deliberate slowness, Julian reached into his worn leather briefcase. The metallic snap of the latches sounded like twin gunshots in the quiet room. He withdrew a single, unassuming manila folder. It wasn't thick, but it carried an invisible weight that instantly shifted the gravity of the room. He slid it calmly across the polished mahogany table, straight toward Brandon. On the tab, written in precise block letters, were 2 words: shareholder records. Brandon chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound, though his hand hesitated for a fraction of a second before opening the cover. "What's this? A list of your grievances? A petition from the staff?" Open it, Julian said quietly. It was the first time he had spoken during the entire meeting, and his voice possessed a deep, resonant calm that commanded immediate, absolute boardroom silence. Brandon flicked the folder open, his eyes scanning the first page with a practiced look of boredom. Then, his fingers froze on the paper. The smug smirk vanished from his face so fast, it looked like it had been violently wiped away. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him a dull, pasty gray under the harsh fluorescent lights. The senior executives around the table exchanged nervous glances, shifting in their seats. They watched Brandon's eyes dart wildly across the rows of certified ledger data, his breathing suddenly shallow. He turned the page, his hands trembling slightly, the heavy gold pen slipping from his fingers and clattering loudly onto the wood. This is a mistake, Brandon stammered, his aggressive posture collapsing into a frantic defensive huddle. This can't be legal. Who gave you access to these institutional accounts? Julian leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. The transformation was complete. The invisible junior manager had vanished, replaced by the most dangerous entity in the corporate ecosystem. A ghost who suddenly materialized with the keys to the castle. 23 years, Brandon, Julian said smoothly, his tone conversational, yet razor-sharp. While your father was busy diluting his stock options to pay for his third divorce, and while you were crashing sports cars in Monaco, I was buying. Every dividend, every bonus, every market dip. I didn't buy sports cars. I bought voting rights. Brandon stared at the final page, where the consolidated voting power was tallied and stamped by the transfer agent. Julian didn't just own a few pity shares. Through a network of private LLCs and personal accounts, Julian controlled a massive strategic block of the company's floating stock, a stake large enough to break any deadlock, and more than enough to dictate terms to the executive committee. The hidden ownership that had grown in the dark for over 2 decades was finally exposed to the light, and it was blinding. You see, Julian added, leaning forward just enough to lock eyes with the terrified young man, I don't just work for this company anymore, Brandon. I own enough of it to decide exactly who stays in this room and who leaves it permanently. Enjoyed the boardroom showdown? Don't miss a single twist in Julian's master plan. Subscribe to our newsletter now to get the next chapters delivered straight to your inbox before anyone else, along with exclusive corporate thriller stories. The silence in the room grew heavy, a suffocating vacuum that swallowed the breathing of the dozen executives frozen in their seats. Brandon looked down at the folder as if it were a dormant explosive that had just begun to beep. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The sharp, predatory young man who had entered the room 20 minutes ago had been completely erased. Julian let the panic marinate. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his lukewarm coffee, the ceramic mug clinking softly against the saucer. In the corporate world, leverage is a beautiful thing, but absolute leverage is art. I believe the word you used earlier was synergy, Brandon, Julian said, his voice cutting through the stillness like a scalpel. And you're right. We do need it. For instance, we need a synergy between the board's decisions and the actual desires of the people who risk their capital on this company. Your restructuring plan? It's dead. It died the moment I signed my proxy voting forms this morning. A vice president from HR nervously cleared his throat, his eyes darting between Julian and the door. Julian, Mr. Vance, if this ownership stake is certified by the SEC, we need to call an emergency governance meeting. This alters the entire quorum for next month's annual meeting. It alters everything today, Julian corrected smoothly, turning his gaze toward the HR executive, who instantly looked down at his shoes. I didn't bring this folder to threaten a future coup. I brought it to announce a change in management. Effective immediately, I am blocking the operational budget for Brandon's division. Brandon's head snapped up, his pale face suddenly flushing with a desperate defensive rage. You can't do that. My father is the chairman. He built this company from the ground up. Your father built a magnificent machine, Brandon, Julian replied, his voice dripping with a chilly, ironic politeness. But he forgot to maintain the gears. While he was busy entertaining activist investors on yachts, He failed to realize that those investors were selling their shares back to the open market during the Q3 dip, shares that my brokers were instructed to vacuum up within milliseconds. Julian leaned forward, placing his palms flat on the table. The illusion of the submissive gray junior manager was entirely gone. In his place was a man who had spent 23 years studying every flaw, every ego, and every vulnerability in this room. He knew their salaries, he knew their operational failures, and now he held their futures in his pocket. The real question here, Julian whispered, the room tilting on its axis as every executive leaned in to hear him, is whether your father will choose to save this company or waste his remaining capital trying to save a son who doesn't know the difference between a balance sheet and a birthright. Brandon's phone, resting on the mahogany table, suddenly vibrated against the wood with a harsh, buzzing sound that made everyone jump. The caller ID lit up with a single word: Chairman. Julian merely gestured toward the device with a polite, mocking wave of his hand. Go ahead, Brandon. Pick it up. I'm sure he's just received the automated filing notification from our transfer agent. He's an ambitious man. He likes to stay informed. With a trembling hand, Brandon swiped the screen and pressed the phone to his ear. The voice that boomed through the receiver was not the confident, commanding tone of the company's founder. It was loud, panicked, and entirely stripped of its usual corporate majesty. Even without the speakerphone on, the frantic words, "What did you do?" and SEC Schedule 13D leaked into the quiet air of the boardroom. Brandon swallowed hard, his eyes locked on Julian's unblinking gaze. Father, Julian has a folder. He's saying he controls the voting block. He doesn't just control a block, you idiot, the chairman roared loud enough for the nearest VP to flinch. He just executed a passive stake conversion. He's the largest individual retail holder on the books. Shut the meeting down right now. The call disconnected with a sharp beep. Brandon slowly lowered the phone, looking at Julian as if he were seeing an entirely different species. The power dynamic in the room hadn't just shifted, it had been completely annihilated. The senior executives, who had spent the last 2 decades treating Julian like an invisible piece of office furniture, were now calculating how to salvage their own careers. Julian stood up, unbuttoning his modest blazer with a calm, practiced ease. He didn't look like a man who had just pulled off a corporate coup. He looked like a man who was simply finishing a long day's work. 23 years of being a legacy bottleneck, Brandon, Julian said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register as he gathered his papers. I've watched your father's loyalists bleed this company dry for bonuses while the actual infrastructure rotted. That ends today. Tomorrow morning, the board will receive a formal request for a special meeting to restructure the executive committee. He placed the manila folder back into his briefcase and snapped the latches shut. The metallic sound echoed like a final gavel strike. You wanted to pass the torch, Brandon, Julian said, offering a final razor-sharp smile as he walked toward the heavy glass doors. Just make sure you don't burn yourself on the way out. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom clicked shut behind Julian, the sound echoing through the executive suite like the closing of a vault. For 23 years, he had walked these carpeted hallways as a ghost, a man whose presence was acknowledged only when a spreadsheet was late or a printer jammed. Today, the very air seemed to part for him. Down in the lobby, the afternoon sun streamed through the massive glass facade, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished granite floor. Julian stepped out of the elevator, his worn leather briefcase tucked firmly under his arm. He could feel the eyes of the receptionist on him. News in a corporate headquarters travels faster than fiber optic data, and rumors of the boardroom execution were already bubbling down through the ranks. He walked past the cubicles where he had spent a quarter of his life. He saw the tired eyes of his colleagues, the stacks of mounting paperwork, and the quiet desperation of an office run by people who only cared about quarterly margins. Julian didn't feel a rush of adrenaline or a surge of arrogant pride. Instead, he felt a profound, heavy sense of clarity. He hadn't destroyed the kingdom. He had simply taken the crown from a child who didn't know how to wield it. As he stepped through the revolving doors and into the crisp afternoon air, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text message from an unknown number, but Julian knew exactly who it was. Julian. We need to talk. Off the record. My private residence tonight. Vance Sr. Julian looked at the screen, a faint smile touching his lips. He didn't reply. For over 2 decades, he had operated on their schedule, answering their summons and fulfilling their directives. The rules of the game had changed permanently. The chairman could wait. He walked down the steps of the corporate plaza, loosening his tie for the first time in memory. The city stretched out before him, loud, chaotic, and full of endless moving parts. For 23 years, he had played the long game, sacrificing the present to secure the future. Now, the future had finally arrived. Julian pulled his car keys from his pocket, unlocked his modest sedan, and tossed his briefcase into the passenger seat. He started the engine, looking back one last time at the towering glass monolith of the headquarters, reflecting the setting sun. Tomorrow he would walk back through those doors, not to manage a department, but to rebuild an empire. But tonight, he was going to enjoy the quietest drive of his life.